All right, folks, let's get started with chapter 21. It's a nice mural painted by William Gropper. We've got 6 sections in this unit or in this chapter, so buckle in. We'll start with number 1. And here's your focus question. Paradoxically, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was raised in privilege on a New York country estate, came to symbolically represent the ordinary American citizen. Like Lincoln, FDR's greatness was his capacity to reject traditional ideas while confronting national crisis. FDR, as he liked to be called, was born in 1882, a fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He graduated from Harvard and served in the New York State Legislature and as Undersecretary of the Navy in World War I. After he ran for vice president on the Democratic ticket in 1920, he contracted polio and lost the use of his legs, a fact concealed from the public in the pre-television era. Very few Americans realized that this powerful president was confined to a wheelchair. In his speech accepting the Democratic nomination for president in 1932, Roosevelt promised a new deal for the American people. But his campaign offered few specific proposals. Roosevelt discussed government's responsibility to ensure that every man had a right to make a comfortable living, but he also wanted a balanced federal budget and criticized Hoover for excessive federal spending. The biggest difference between Hoover and FDR's campaigns was the Democrats' call to repeal prohibition. Americans desperately wanted new leadership. Roosevelt won an overwhelming 57% of the popular vote, and Democrats gained a majority in both houses of Congress. The Depression provoked different responses across the globe. For most of the 1930s, conservative governments ruled in Britain and France, and they did little to resolve the crisis. In Germany, Adolf Hitler of the Nazi Party established one of the most brutal dictatorships in human history, banning all political opposition and terrorizing Jews. In the Soviet Union, the tyrannical Joseph Stalin launched 5-year plans that industrialized that nation and allegedly eliminated unemployment, but at great social cost. Japan's militarist government invaded China in 1937 and aspired to dominate all Asia. Roosevelt envisioned the New Deal as an alternative to socialism, fascism, and unregulated capitalism. He wanted to reconcile democracy, individual liberty, and economic planning. But he did not begin his first term as president with a full-fledged plan. He initially depended on a group of intellectuals and social workers who took key positions in his administration. They included Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, a veteran of Hull House and the New York Consumers League; Harry Hopkins, who directed emergency relief during Roosevelt's term as New York's governor; Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, a veteran of Theodore Roosevelt's progressive campaign of 1912; and Louis Brandeis, who had advised Woodrow Wilson in 1912 and now advised FDR while serving on the Supreme Court. Although these individuals represented the influence of progressivism on Roosevelt and the New Deal, they had no unified position. Brandeis, for one, thought large corporations not only were too powerful, but also had contributed to the Depression by keeping prices artificially high and limiting workers' purchasing power. He argued they should be broken up, not regulated. Yet the Brain Trust, a group of academics that included a number of Columbia University professors, thought bigness was inevitable in a modern economy. They believed the competitive marketplace had disappeared and that large firms should be managed and directed by the government, not broken up. Their view decisively shaped what came to be known as the First New Deal. FDR realized that Americans needed leadership and action immediately, and when he took office on March 4, 1933, he acted quickly. He started a campaign of reassuring Americans and restoring their confidence. At his inauguration, he declared that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. His first step was to confront a banking system about to collapse. Banks that had invested funds in the stock market were failing, and by March 1933, banking was suspended in most states. Roosevelt declared a bank holiday, temporarily halting all bank operations, and called a special session of Congress, which, on March 9th, passed the Emergency Banking Act to provide funds to endangered banks. Additional measures transformed the American financial system. The Glass-Steagall Act barred commercial banks from buying and selling stocks, and until its repeal in the 90s, it helped prevent many of the irresponsible practices that had led to the stock market crash. The same law established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured the accounts of individual depositors. Roosevelt also took the United States off the gold standard, thus breaking the link between the nation's currency and the gold reserves and making it possible to issue more money and stimulate more business activity. These efforts together saved the financial system and greatly increased the government's power over it. While 5,000 banks had failed between 29 and 33, a full third of all the banks in the U.S., not one bank failed in 1936. The Banking Acts were the first of a series of laws passed in the first 3 months of FDR's administration, a period known as the 100 Days. Roosevelt used the crisis and his electoral mandate to pressure Congress into passing laws to stimulate the economy. Congress established a plethora of alphabet agencies, such as the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, to direct the recovery. Never had an American president exercised so much power or so quickly expanded the role of the federal government in Americans' lives. The key to Roosevelt's plan for recovery was the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, largely based on the government business partnership created by the War Industries Board in World War I. The law established a National Recovery Administration, the NRA, to set industry codes with groups of business leaders that would serve as guidelines for output, prices, and working conditions. This, it was hoped, would end the cutthroat competition that drove companies out of business, in part by accepting these industry-wide agreements from antitrust laws. FDR thus effectively repudiated an older idea of liberty based on the belief that the best way to encourage economic activity and ensure a fair distribution of wealth was to allow market competition to unfold free from government interference. To win support from labor, Section 7A of the NIRA recognized workers' rights to organize unions, which was a sharp departure from the open shop policies of the 1920s and a move toward industrial freedom. The NRA soon adopted codes that set standards for production, prices, and wages in the textile, steel, mining, and auto industries. The agency itself launched a publicity campaign to promote itself, and its symbol, the Blue Eagle, was displayed in stores and factories affected by the codes. But the NRA became controversial when it was shown to have allowed large companies to dominate the code writing process. Large corporations and companies raised prices, limited production, laid off workers, and divided markets among themselves at the expense of smaller competitors. Many anti-union companies ignored Section 7A. The agency lacked the personnel to enforce the 750 codes throughout the nation by 1935. The NRA did not create recovery or cooperation between capital and labor. The 100 Days also saw the issues of government relief to the needy. Roosevelt and most of his advisors believed direct government payments to the unemployed would erode individual self-reliance, and the Economy Act reduced federal spending in the hopes of winning business support. But with nearly 25% unemployment, spending funds on relief was inevitable. In May 1933, Congress established the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to make grants to local relief agencies. But FDR preferred to create temporary jobs that would decrease unemployment while improving the nation's infrastructure of roads, bridges, public buildings, and parks. In March 1933, Congress established the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, which set unemployed young men to work on projects such as forest preservation and the improvement of national parks and wildlife preserves. By its end, in 1942, the CCC had employed more than 3 million people. The National Industrial Recovery Act also created the Public Works Administration with an appropriation of $3.3 billion. Directed by Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, the PWA built roads, schools, hospitals, and other public facilities. In November of 1933, the Civil Works Administration was launched, and within a few months it employed more than 4 million people in constructing highways, tunnels, courthouses, and airports. But costs soon skyrocketed, and criticisms mounted that the New Deal was creating a class of Americans permanently dependent on government jobs. In response, FDR dismantled the CWA. Other public works projects involved government-planned economic transformation, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built dams to prevent flooding along the Tennessee River Valley and provide cheap electricity in a region with many isolated and rustic households. The TVA was the first time the federal government produced electricity in competition with private companies, and it served as a model for regional planning that would economically develop the West. The 100 Days also included efforts to improve conditions for farmers. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration let the government try to raise farm prices by establishing production quotas for major crops and paying farmers not to plant more. Many crops were destroyed, and most controversially, 6 million pigs were slaughtered. The AAA successfully raised farm prices and incomes, but large farmers benefited the most, and few small farmers, tenant farmers, or agricultural laborers received assistance. AAA policies actually encouraged the eviction of tenants, many of whom took to the roads and migrated to the West Coast. The beginning in 1930 of unusually dry weather in the Midwest also worsened the Depression's effect on rural America. By the mid-1930s, the most severe drought in the nation's history caused soil that had deteriorated from modern farming methods to simply blow away in the wind, creating the Dust Bowl, as areas in Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado and Kansas were called. The drought and storms displaced more than 1 million farmers, whose massive trek to the Pacific coast was captured in John Steinbeck's novel The Grapes of Wrath. Another New Deal initiative, the Resettlement Administration, which was founded in 1934, relocated rural and urban families in communities planned by the federal government in areas like Greenbelt, just outside of Washington, D.C. By the late 1920s, homeownership had become a sign of respectability among the middle class and offered security to workers who faced low wages, irregular employment, and limited occupational mobility. But then the Depression destroyed the American housing industry. The building of new homes virtually halted, and banks and savings and loan associations that financed home ownership collapsed or survived by foreclosing on mortgages. President Hoover established a federally sponsored bank to issue home loans, but only with the New Deal did the federal government systematically intervene in the housing market. Roosevelt stated that the security of the home was a fundamental right. In 1933 and 34, his administration undertook efforts to protect homeowners from foreclosure and stimulate new construction. The Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration insured millions of long-term mortgages issued by private banks. The government also built thousands of units of low-rent housing. Thanks to the FHA and later the Veterans Administration, homeownership became a reality for tens of millions of families. In FDR's first 2 years, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing prohibition. The Federal Communications Commission was established to supervise radio and telephone communications, and the Securities and Exchange Commission was created to regulate the stock and bond markets. The first New Deal was a series of experiments, some of which failed, that transformed the role of the federal government and assisted millions of Americans in the midst of the Depression. But it did not end the Depression. In 1934, 10 million Americans, more than 20% of the labor force, were still out of work. In 1935, the Supreme Court, still dominated by conservative Republican judges who believed in 19th century notions of freedom, such as liberty of contract, began to strike down New Deal laws. The NRA was declared unconstitutional because its codes and regulations delegated legislative powers to the president and attempted to regulate local businesses not engaged in interstate commerce. In January 1936, the court killed the AAA, which it declared an unconstitutional use of congressional power over local economic activity. In June 1936, the court ruled that New York could not set a minimum wage for women and children. So, that's the end of our first section. We'll be back for the second.